Hello, I'm Alex Penn and welcome to the third session of Industrial Ecology and Human Ecosystems Design. So, what we're going to be doing in this session is, well, you've already been doing some design work, you've already done a large chunk of the design work in the last session. So I'm just going to remind you of the design cycle, the process that you're going through. We're going to have a bit more time to have a look at what you've done already and analyse a little bit further, because the analysis process, as we discussed previously, is extremely important. And then you're going to be moving on to design, the sort of exciting phase, where basically you'll be putting all the pieces together, using all the analysis and surveying that you've done, and actually starting to put things in place in your industrial ecosystem. I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of a technique that you can use if you're a bit stuck, and then talk about going back through the cycle again after you've started to put things in place, and then I'll just give you an overview of your final design write-up that you should be doing and how you might evaluate that. So, as you'll all remember by now, I'm sure, so our goal in designing these industrial ecosystems is to construct a cyclic or circular metabolism. We do this by creating industrial symbioses. So the outputs or wastes of one company can be inputs for another, and really by making beneficial connections between pairs of companies or multiple companies in the system. And really, very importantly, we're not just thinking about materials and energies here. We're thinking about the triple bottom line, environment, economy, and society, and trying to positively make connections in all of those domains. But also, very importantly, and what makes this sort of design work different from just standard industrial symbiosis, is that you're doing whole systems design. You're not just picking out individual symbioses to meet the needs of two different companies. You're trying to think about a strategy and these symbioses which construct that will work to make the whole region function in the best way possible based on the resources and constraints it has, and really trying to construct a whole ecosystem. So, where are we? Well, last time we went through the survey stage. So you had your design brief and your map, and from that you listed the elements that you had and their inputs and outputs. You listed the resources and constraints that were in your system, and you really thought about the context of the system, social, political, environmental, the very broad context of the system, which often can make more of a difference to whether these things happen than the actual technical issues concerned. Then you moved through to the analysis stage. So coming back to your inputs and outputs, you looked at where there were gaps and leaks in the system, what inputs for companies were not being met within the system, or inputs for the people, in fact, anything in the system, what elements, inputs were not being met from within the system, and what outputs were being wasted or sent out of the system or becoming pollution in the system. You thought about how you could use the resources of the system productively and how you could mitigate or make positive the constraints or limiting factors in your system, turning them around to use them as resources. And this has basically, or should have by this point, led you to your overarching strategies or themes that are going to frame your design work, which you're going to move on to now. So, firstly, I want you to come back to your analysis stage a little bit, and I want you to revise in your session, together in your groups, the decisions that you've already made and the themes and strategies that you came up with. And you've had a bit of time to reflect between now and then. Do these themes and strategies make sense to you? Are you going with those? Just make sure you're happy with your themes and strategies and they work. And then start to think, okay, well, you've got all these elements in the system, but there will probably be, for some of these themes and strategies, to use some of the resources that you've got, new elements that you'll need in the system as well. So go through that process again of listing those elements, listing the new things that you might need, and then their inputs or needs and outputs or behaviours. And this allows you basically to kind of construct an idea of how you're going to connect these things into the system. And then after you've done all of this analysis, finally, we're moving you on to the design process, you'll be glad to hear. So we're moving through the cycle. We should have spent 80% of our time surveying and analysing, and then we finally start to put things together. So the big component of this design stage is placement. So remember, what this is all about is making connections. So putting your elements together and making beneficial connections between them. So this should follow quite naturally from what you've done so far. Keeping in mind the design principles or heuristics that we talked about in natural ecosystems, you should find that with the analysis that you've done, this kind of makes sense and you can start to build it in quite quickly. So waste is a resource in this system, so you had all of the inputs and outputs analysis that you've got. You know that unused outputs are waste or pollution and the unmet needs of work, and that what you're aiming for is to cycle materials and energy. So start to think about the key beneficial connections that you could make. And this should all be informed by your themes and strategies. What are the key things to put in place? So these mutualisms within the system in which both parties or all parties in the relationship benefit. So they should be benefiting environmentally, economically, but hopefully also socially too. So start to put these key things in place. And then what we're also thinking about, if you recall, in the system is that we have a large amount of functional diversity. And this is quite important to build a whole industrial ecosystem. We don't just have one or two industries. If we have a large range of inputs and outputs in the system, we can have a large number of connections. So firstly, try to meet or connect everything that's already there in the system, but think about putting in key industries, putting those new elements that you've generated in place so that you have sufficient functional diversity to produce a whole ecosystem. And then really placement. I mean, you've got already, as I asked you to write your elements on Post-it notes rather than drawing them on the map. And you'll see now where this really starts to become useful. Because thinking about how you're going to connect things together, it's usually, as we mentioned in the case of the power station, for example, with the heat transfer and the steam, it's usually very important that things are close together because often a lot of these waste materials are low density, relatively low value, and maybe difficult or technically difficult to transport long distances. So when you've got your elements on your Post-it notes, placing them together on the map, you'll be able to see, okay, if I put these two things together, these are the connections I could make. So don't be afraid to move your elements around your map and start to put in place your ideas about where things can fit together. Obviously, if you've got a very large factory or several factories that are already in the system, already built, then you'd have to really justify moving those factories. So in that sort of case, you might want to think about key infrastructure, extra elements in terms of infrastructure that you might have to put in place to connect those things. But really think about this physical proximity and what you could do around the elements in your system. Okay, so as I said, real design tips here may sound sort of simple and stupid, but don't draw on the map too soon. Have everything down on your Post-it notes, your elements and resources, and then you can move them around and make sure you're making correct decisions rather than trapping yourself by just drawing something on the map too early. Start to make these beneficial connections and really thinking about your themes and your priorities that you've come up with based on your surveying and analysis. Start to close the loops using your input and output analysis, using your resources, using all the outputs in the system. And your strategies or themes should really give you an idea, or you've come up with an idea of what's most important for the system. So think about getting those connections or those elements in place first, because they're going to be the core of your system, and then you will start to build on that. And if you're getting a bit stuck about how things can fit together, then it's always worth trying a random assembly activity. So, as I said, you have everything on Post-it notes or on pieces of paper, all your elements. Just try putting them in a pile and pulling out two elements, okay, randomly, and doing this multiple times. Think about those two elements that you've got, and look at their inputs and outputs that you've listed for them. how could they be connected together? Try to think as creatively as possible. What possible connections could you make between them? And this can, if you're really stuck about kind of putting things together, this can be just a good way to kind of get that sort of thinking going. So you're starting to put things in place. You've constructed the core of your system with putting in place beneficial connections. But one thing that's really important to say, despite the fact that we're going through this cycle, don't be afraid to go backwards. I mean, and this is very common if you're designing. It's very sensible that when you start to design, you'll probably find there are things that you don't know or you haven't thought about. So think about you're growing the system. You've put in place the core components, and then other things start to suggest themselves, and then you're going to want to go back and analyse again. New elements suggest themselves. Okay, actually, we need to go back to analysis and think about inputs and outputs here. We need to think about how those fit in with our themes and strategies. So really don't be afraid to return back through the cycle a couple of stages and think again. And this is going to be particularly important because actually in the way that I have structured this exercise for you, I want you to kind of go through the exercise once and then go back and really think, have I missed anything? Have we missed anything? What's missing here? What resources aren't we using? What leaks are we not plugging? So make sure you've not missed things. But also, one of the key points that I really want to get across to you here is this is not just about technical connections of materials and energy. We really need to think about economic, social, political factors, meeting the bottom line and thinking about all of the benefits, all of the connections in their broadest sense that we can get in these regional industrial ecosystems. So I want you to do a second pass through really and just make sure that you are taking into account these social factors and the contextual factors and try to make positive social connections as much as you can, whether they're training, education, providing public goods of whatever kind. Really think about how that fits into the system as well. And that's what makes us different from just a straightforward industrial ecology. And ultimately, this kind of context, something that works for people in the region, something that works politically and makes those kinds of connections with human society is what is going to be a sustainable design. It's what will allow people to accept it. What makes it productive and economically viable and positive, something positive for the region. That's what real sustainability is all about. So really key, as we're trying to get you to think about throughout this, is that the designs that you produce satisfy this triple bottom line: environment, economy and society. And that really is what will make these things sustainable in the long term. Okay, and finally, so really, after you've finished your design work and you've come up with a system that you're happy with, you'll spend the last part of your session drawing up the elements on the second copy of your map, drawing up your connections and elements. Finally, I'm allowing you to draw on your map here. And then, so you've got a final version of the map that you can present to your classmates. And then also, just on a separate piece of paper, I'm going to ask you to describe and justify some of your key design decisions and how they meet the triple bottom line, how they fulfill these sort of principles that we've been talking about. So just pull out a few of your key decisions. And then also think about evaluating this. How would this design work in the context of your own country? So what are the challenges or barriers that came in really to your mind when thinking about this in the context that you're familiar with? So would this work? Could this happen in your region? Thank you, and I hope you enjoy it.